Testing, testing. Yes, that's right. This week, loads of testing happened at Starbase with Ship 38, Pad 2 deluge tests, a booster 18.1 test tank, and thanks to some scrubs, there's even more testing coming up soon. We also did a flyover of Starbase, and we're lucky enough to see some interesting new ship hardware that happened to be outside. Plus, of course, all of the progress on Pad 2, the new Giga Bay, the reconstruction of the Massey Outpost, and a lot more. I wasn't the only one that flew this week, though. Our Florida team also flew over the Space Coast, so you know we have to talk about all of Starship's progress in Florida. I know, it's gonna be a lot. What's up, Star fans? I'm Jack Beyer for NSF, and this is your ultra jam-packed Starbase update. Let's start first with the infrastructure work, and then we'll get into all of the testing that's happened and what's going to happen next. One of the places where testing has occurred a lot recently is the Massey Outpost, but as I'm sure you remember, it also has been undergoing repair and upgrade work following Ship 36's explosion back in June. Yes, it's already been more than 3 months since that happened. Time flies, much like parts of Ship 36 did. Since the last time we checked the site from the air, SpaceX has progressed rather quickly through the repair work on the static fire test area at the Massey Outpost. As we outlined during our previous flyover, most of the work here seems to be aimed at preventing the ground systems from being severely damaged if another Ship 36 type event were to happen again. These upgrades involved moving fluid and power lines underground, as we can see here in these shots. SpaceX also had to rebuild some of the systems that had been damaged during the explosion, such as the control bunker for the static fire stand. This time, it's being rebuilt with thick concrete walls for protection. Teams are also building a brand new general control bunker further away, closer to the entrance to Massey Outpost, which will be used for the entirety of the facility. Similarly, a lot of the distribution systems for fluids and other commodities out to the static fire stand are now being encased in a concrete structure right before where the service structure will go for the static fire stand. If you remember, the old service structure was completely destroyed in the Ship 36 explosion, so a new one has to be built from scratch. At the time of this flyover, teams had begun installing the first structural pieces for that new service structure, which, as its name implies, will provide an interface between the ground systems and the ship to service it with all the commodities and other functions needed during static fire testing. Since our last flight, teams seem to also have refurbished the water deluge tank farm at the site and have upgraded the methane tank farm as well. This tank farm is a bit further away than the previous one, and it almost seems like they may build a blast wall next to it for additional protection at some point down the line. From another perspective, we can also see curved pipes laying next to the flame trench at the static fire stand at Massey's. These could be either damaged pipes from the flame trench bucket from when 36 exploded, or they could be some of the pipes that may have been needed in order to repair that bucket. We also spotted some crane parts that were from that crane that fell over back in June during the Ship 36 cleanup efforts. They're really taking a long time to clean all that up. I wonder if there's like an investigation ongoing or something. They're really taking their time to clean up all of that mess. From above, we could also see all the work that's been going on for the new booster cryo station, as well as the new booster thrust simulator stand, which will be used on the upcoming generation of boosters. All right, we'll come back to the Massey Outpost when it's time to talk about some of the testing that's happened there, but for now, that's a good chunk of the work going on there. They're quite busy, as you can see, and that makes a lot of sense, given that the Massey Outpost is critical to the testing and launch flow here in Starbase. Moving over to Starbase proper, let's head to the Sanchez lot, where there are some interesting pieces of hardware worthy of pointing out. A big one is, of course, the ship quick disconnect arm that will be installed at the Pad 2 tower. Teams have been working on this arm for quite some time, modifying it to a newer design compared to the one at Pad 1. While the base structure is similar to the arm at Pad 1, the internals have changed substantially, with more of the control panels and access platforms located closer to the tower rather than on the Pad 1 tower where they're located further from the tower. This sort of makes sense, as that would put all those fiddly bits of hardware further away from the blast of Raptor exhaust during launch, since they're closer to the tower, so they're further away from Raptor exhaust. We're not fully sure when the arm might be installed, but it's not like it's going to be needed for a few more months, so SpaceX can take all the time they need. The Sanchez lot also hosts a bunch of the transport stands, tooling, and some of the other test stands, including the ship thrust simulator stand. This stand is the one that's used to carry out cryogenic proof testing of ships, and it has 6 rams that push up against the aft of the ship to simulate the thrust of Raptor engines. From high above, we can see that teams are working on this stand, as evidenced by the umbrellas set up on it, which are often used for protection while welders are working on various hardware. And yes, that little stubby nose cone thing next to it is all that remains of Ship 26. Sorry, Ship 26 fan club. It makes sense that they may be modifying the stand, since Block 3 ships have a much different aft section compared to the current version of ships. On the one hand, it's going to use Raptor 3, which is a much more powerful engine, and on the other hand, the aft dome and engine placement will also be different, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. Remember the interesting ship hardware I mentioned at the top of the show? Yeah. Anyway, at the north end of the Sanchez lot, right next to the Mega Bays, are also a bunch of pieces for work platforms that will be installed in Mega Bay 1 to be able to work on Block 3 boosters. Neat! Meanwhile, at the production site, SpaceX has continued with foundation work for the massive Giga Bay facility that will produce the Starship vehicles of the future. We've seen a lot of this progress already from the ground in the form of endless concrete deliveries and rebar being laid down, but the aerial view gives us a good comparison of that work since our last flyover, which was about 2 months ago. We now have an even clearer view of the 2 transfer aisles that will be used in the Giga Bay, each one having 6 work cells on either side, for a total of 24 workstations that will be used for construction as well as inspections and refurbishment of flown vehicles. In general, a lot of this work is work that we've already seen at the Giga Bay facility being built at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, so we can also correlate some of the work between both construction sites. For example, these 4 squares are going to be part of the elevator shafts that will be used inside the building to access its different levels. Now, to build such a large structure, crawler cranes just aren't enough. So 2 pairs of fixed tower cranes will be set up here in order to help with the construction. These will be installed a bit differently than the way we've seen them installed in Florida. The ones in Florida are being set up 2 on each transfer aisle, whereas at Starbase, the 4 tower cranes will be over 4 of the work cells in the Giga Bay. Something for you crane nerds out there. Now, let's move to the launch site, because if you thought that was all of the construction work here at Starbase, well, you got a lot more coming. Right across the launch site, there's in fact some important construction going on, which is the air separation unit. Once built, this will supply oxygen and nitrogen needed at the Starship tank farm located at the launch site across the street, thus avoiding having to truck all of that into the area. It appears that the drilling of the foundation piles is now complete, given the continuous flight augering driller is now no longer at the site. We can also see that SpaceX has built a sort of protection wall around the location, likely to prevent flooding from ruining the site. As you can see, the air separation unit will be really close to the beach, so things like strong rainstorms combined with a high tide could easily make this area prone to flooding. Just ask me how I know. This week featured a torrent of testing, including additional tests of Pad 2's deluge system. The first one of these happened on Thursday while everyone was looking at Ship 38 sitting on the launch mount, so it kind of caught us by surprise. That means we only had a few angles of this test, but so it goes. SpaceX tested the deluge system again the next day on Friday. Well, we were also still looking at Ship 38 and waiting for it to be tested. This time though, we did have more cameras pointed at Pad 2, just in case, so we got some pretty good shots of the test as it happened. Compared to the test we covered on last week's episode, this one was way more powerful, with much more water coming out of the flame trench. Also, the weir relief vent at the water deluge tank farm went a bunch higher, even surpassing the height of the ship QD arm, which is like 300 feet up. That's wild. What's even more interesting is the fact that they did another test less than 20 minutes after the first one that day. And as I said before, this had happened on Friday, after a deluge test had already occurred on Thursday. So where the heck is all that water coming from? Unless I missed it, we didn't exactly see a convoy of water trucks headed to Pad 2. It turns out that, unlike at Pad 1, the Pad 2 flame trench has sump pumps that collect the water out of the bottom of the trench and put it back in the storage tanks. We could see the inlets for these pumps during our flyover, so this probably is what allowed SpaceX to refill the farm and do Friday's tests after having used the water already on Thursday. I hope this means SpaceX won't need as much water trucked in after tests or flights from Pad 2, but surely some amount of that water will get turned into steam during launch, but I guess we'll see. Either way, pretty cool. On top of that, if the water deluge system activates at Pad 2 but an abort happens, it's very likely they'd still be able to fire it again on the same day if they were able to clear whatever prompted the abort. This is something that's impossible with the current setup at Pad 1. Now, all of this testing we've seen of the deluge system has been through the flame trench and bucket. We expect in the future to see testing of the water-cooled deck on top of the launch mount, which will also have water running through it to cool it and protect it during launches. However, the outfitting work is still ongoing at the launch mount for that system, so we'll have to wait a little bit until we see testing of that side of the deluge system. Hopefully on Pad 2, this will mean we won't see the same roasting that the launch mount on Pad 1 gets every launch. On Flight 10, our cinematographer, D. Wise, captured an amazing slow-motion video of liftoff, which really showed how Pad 1's launch mount gets roasted. In fact, in our shop, we have a print of this called Return from the Fire, which you can purchase and have on your wall many years from now, so you can point at it and say, back in my day, Starship launch pads used to get roasted at liftoff. We also have a bunch of other prints, both metal and paper, in the NSF store if you want to check those out. A portion of the sale of each print goes to the photographer who made the image, and it's extremely helpful. You get to support our work, and in exchange, you get a neat piece of art to hang on your wall. Since our last Starbase update episode, SpaceX also brought in another deluge tank to be installed at the deluge tank farm. During our flyover, it was in the process of being connected to the water systems at the pad. We can also see that since our last flyover, teams have made a great deal of progress building the blast wall that will protect that area of the launch site during launches. Now that we're talking about the deluge system, it's also worth pointing out the work that SpaceX has done to create a runoff pond at the south end of the Pad 2 area. This is where all the water that doesn't go down into the trench or on the immediate sides of the launch mount will end up at. This area looks like it will be complete really soon. SpaceX also is continuing to install more and more cladding on both the launch tower and the service structure next to the launch mount. It's exciting to see completed areas closed out with these shields, knowing that that means we're marching ever closer to launches from Pad 2. Since our last flyover, teams have also completed the staging and lifting pad for Pad 2 as well. This is where ships and boosters will come to be lifted off or lowered down onto their transport stands using Tower 2's chopsticks. You might also remember from our last flyover that we had spotted the very first 2 hold-down clamps already installed on the launch mount. Fast forward to this flyover, and all 20 of them are now installed on the hold-down arms. Now, what remains is for SpaceX to install the protective hoods that will cover up the hold-down arms after they retract into the launch mount following liftoff. In fact, we can see some of these at Sanchez waiting to be installed on the launch mount. Alright, that sort of covers all the construction work around Starbase. Now we'll go back to the Massey Outpost, where SpaceX repeatedly tested the Booster 18.1 test tank. Booster 18.1 underwent different cryo tests this week, one on the 15th, another on the 16th, and another one on the 18th. The test on September 18th was the 10th and likely final one for Booster 18.1 because during the test, a large sideways stream of nitrogen was seen coming from the tank, which was definitely not like anything we've seen in prior tests. The jet of nitrogen appeared to be coming from one of the test stand rams that push against the inside of the tank. It could be either that SpaceX tested Booster 18.1 to destruction on purpose, or something on Booster 18.1 broke during testing that wasn't expected. Or something could have broken on the RAM itself, I suppose. In case you don't remember, the Booster 18.1 test article is the one that's meant to test the redesigned booster aft assembly for Block 3 vehicles. It's really interesting, though, that they tested Booster 18.1 so many times. They really wanted to get a lot of data out of it before moving on to a flight vehicle. While Booster 18.1 testing might have come to an end, we may see more test tank testing at Massey's soon. Remember the Booster 18.3 test tank that had been moved to the Giga Bay in the last couple of weeks? Well, there it was welded to the common dome barrel section that Caesar had spotted inside the Star Factory a few weeks ago. The 2 barrel stack was also installed on the old structural test stand and rolled outside to the ring yard. Remember, this structural test stand had been fitted with 6 new rams and modified from its previous configuration. We're not fully sure yet how this is all going to work, but we may find out soon because on Friday night, Booster 18.3 rolled up Highway 4 to the Massey Outpost for testing. With more and more test tanks popping up left, right, and center, it raises the question of when Block 3 ships and boosters really will be ready to go through testing and flight. I mean, Booster 18's last major hardware install took place in early July and had seemingly stopped, but that was until this week. Remember from last week's episode, that little tank with a conical end up top? Well, this week, it rolled out from the Star Factory while riding on a weird piece of tooling and went into Giga Bay 1. At first, we all thought, oh, there we go, another test tank will be stacked in Giga Bay 1. But during our flyover, we spotted Booster 18 had been moved off of the welding turntable on the front right corner of the bay and had been moved to the front center area. Furthermore, we can see the booster is resting on some sort of white structure that matches the structure holding the small tank that rolled into Giga Bay 1. So, what we thought was just a test tank was in reality flight hardware, and it was installed on Booster 18. Given the position of the tank on the white stool stand, it must have been installed on the side of the booster near the bottom of the liquid oxygen tank. It's likely that this tank will be used for the booster's landing process. We're not fully sure how that will work yet, but we think the big thick transfer tube running through the LOX tank gets split at some point, leaving a reserve of liquid oxygen that might be used for the booster's return. Current generation boosters do have a similar setup with an integrated tank inside the liquid oxygen tank that serves as a liquid oxygen reserve for the landing burn. However, according to SpaceX's post back in July, next-gen boosters will reserve propellant not just for landing, but also for boost back burn. So the bigger and thicker transfer tube could be used for the boost back burn, with the additional little weird tank on the side being used for landing. This is of course just one of many theories being thrown around in the community. We're not even sure if the secondary tank holds extra liquid oxygen or extra liquid methane. But either way, given where it's located, it most likely holds extra propellant for landing. Following the installation of this extra tank, teams rolled out the engine section of Booster 18 and moved the tank installation tool out of the Mega Bay and to the ring yard. So that means the bottom half of Booster 18 is now complete, and we're now just waiting on the top half of the booster to be stacked. It'll be interesting to see if SpaceX waits to test the Booster 18.3 forward dome test tank first before starting the top of the booster, or if they do that work in parallel. One thing is for sure, this time around, they're being a lot more cautious about rushing to build new vehicle designs before doing subsystem testing. Another interesting piece of hardware that rolled out to the ring yard this week was a barrel section with a dome on top. That dome there might lead you to think it's a forward dome, maybe for a ship or a booster, but it's actually a ship aft dome that hasn't been flipped yet. Remember when we used to see the dome flips outside the old tents in the original ring yard? I do. The tooling in the Star Factory can only build domes in one orientation, so after the aft barrel section is welded to the dome, it gets flipped into the right orientation for stacking. This section, however, does not appear to be for flight, and this could be why it had been rolled out in the wrong orientation. It's scrap, but this is also a blessing in itself because it lets us see some of the features of the Block 3 ship aft domes. We were also lucky that it rolled out while I was flying over, so I was able to spot it from above. You can see 3 different holes in the dome itself, all 120 degrees apart. These appear to be inserts for the RVAC engines for Block 3 ships. This is much different than the current design. On current ships, the RVACs are still mounted directly on the dome, while the center engines are mounted to an aft cap or thrust puck in the middle of the dome. However, given what we can see in this scrap ship aft section, the RVACs look to now be instead poking into the LOX tank and will have their own cavity for protection, similar to how the grid fin motors and other associated hardware will be inside the methane tank of the booster. This would also mean the dome might be located further down the ship, increasing the volume of the LOX tank. This could explain why Block 3 ships will hold an extra 100 metric tons of propellant despite them not being stretched compared to Block 2 ships. Move a tank dome here and another one there and bam! You've got a bit more volume to account for the extra 100 metric tons. While that aft section was a scrapped barrel, more future hardware is being built inside the Star Factory. Caesar spotted a few barrels through the windows of the Star Factory, including one with a label indicating it was one of the barrel sections for Booster 19's top half. At the same time, teams continue building out more ships, as evidenced by the work going on in what we call the nose cone hall. Ship 39, the first Block 3 ship, has received a whole lot more tiles on its nose cone since we saw it last week, and I really can't wait to see SpaceX begin stacking it so we can finally see a complete Block 3 ship. In the future, ships and boosters won't just be launched from here at Starbase, but also in Florida on the Space Coast. In order to do that, SpaceX will use a vessel to transport the vehicles between Starbase and the Cape. This week, Elon revealed on X that the name for that ship will be You'll Thank Me Later, a reference to one of the ships in the Culture book series, just like the names for all 3 Falcon drone ships. SpaceX's Vice President of Launch, Kiko Donchev, confirmed on X our previous reporting that both ships and boosters would be transported horizontally. He also mentioned that initially they'll move just one ship or booster at a time, but later they'll likely move multiple vehicles per trip. This will build up a nice fleet of boosters and ships at the Cape that will allow SpaceX to begin Starship launches from there while they set up shop and build up their Florida production facilities. This week, as I said in the intro, our Florida team was able to do a flyover of the Space Coast and spotted the progress at the site to prepare for Starship's future. Now, I won't spoil everything, of course, because for that, you're going to have to watch the upcoming Space Coast update episode later this week. But I do have to mention a few noteworthy things from the flyover. For example, SpaceX is continuing to build new Starship tower modules at Roberts Road, with the 5th being under construction at the time of our flyover. It turns out that modules 4 and 5 have attachment points for a ship quick disconnect arm, which most likely means that this tower is a launch tower rather than just a catch tower. Given that, we can infer that this is most likely one of the 2 launch towers that will be going at Space Launch Complex 37 at the Cape. As I said, there'll be much more in-depth analysis of what we spotted in Florida on the next Space Coast update, which should be releasing in a few days, so stay tuned. As if we didn't have enough going on this week, another piece of interesting news that came out was a draft environmental assessment from the FAA, which studies the environmental impacts of updated airspace closures for launch and reentry. In particular, these updated airspace closures allow new launch trajectories that will fly over land while avoiding some of the major population centers in Mexico and Florida. These launch trajectories should allow Starship to reach orbital inclinations in the low 30 degrees. Given the fact that one of these Starlink orbital shells is at 32 degrees inclination, these new launch trajectories would be ideal to populate that shell. These orbital inclinations in the low 30s would also be high enough in inclination that they would intersect with the Florida launch sites at LC-39A and Slick-37. That means that Starships could launch from Starbase and meet with tankers or depots launched from Starbase, but also from Florida, since they'd be able to launch into that orbit from there. As for the updated reentry airspace closures, the document shows a big area for the ship's reentry and landing back at the launch site from one of these kinds of orbits. Previous assessments had studied a reentry back to the launch site more from the southwest to the northeast, while this one is more from the northwest to the southeast. At the end of the document, the FAA states that, quote, "The FAA has concluded that no significant impacts would occur as a result of the proposed action." End quote. This doesn't mean that SpaceX is approved yet for this, though. The FAA has opened up a public comment period that runs until October 20th to submit any corrections or complaints to this assessment. It is also setting up a virtual public meeting that should take place on October 7th. The comments will give the FAA further input into the review process and help them decide whether more work needs to be done or not. A record of decision will then be issued, which we hope will contain a finding of no significant impact, also known as a FONSI. This would clear the new aircraft closure zones from an environmental standpoint, but SpaceX would still need a license modification to include them in the launch license and be able to use them. In other words, none of the stuff in this environmental assessment is for Flight 11, as that's going to be another suborbital flight, and it's probably at least a few flights into Block 3 that ship reentry will need to come into play. That being said, we did have a bunch of action this week related to Flight 11, like, Ship 38 rolling to the launch site and being installed on Pad 1 for static fire testing. Following Booster 15's static fire test campaign a couple of weeks ago, teams modified the launch mount to allow Ship 38 to go through its own test campaign, and in a matter of days, here it was at the pad. I gotta say, the heat shield on Ship 38 looks so good. Last week, we got a really great technical update from SpaceX Vice President of Build and Flight Reliability, Bill Gerstenmaier. He said that thanks to all the data collected on Ship 37's heat shield on Flight 10, they would no longer try to do as many of the heat shield tests on Flight 11. So it was sort of expected that Ship 38's thermal protection system would look really good rather than all patchy, but we also didn't expect to look so complete at this point in the testing and pre-launch flow. On previous ships, SpaceX normally left a bunch of the thermal protection system work for after the static fire testing happened, but this time there's only a handful of tiles missing in the nose cone area and a few others in one of the flaps, and that's basically it. Ship 38's heat shield also looks a lot better because it features the crunch wrap that Gerst had also mentioned last week. This is a special way of gap filling the tiles that SpaceX used in certain areas of Ship 37, where they just use the same white felt that's installed on the back of the heat shield, but it's instead wrapped around the back and sides of each tile, hence the crunch wrap name. According to Gerst, these tiles, the ones with the crunch wrap, worked really well, and because of that, most of the tiles on Ship 38 now have it. So that's why the outlines in between each tiles is all white and pretty on Ship 38. It really does look nice. Hooray for crunch wrap! Now, of course, with Ship 38 at the pad, the important thing is the testing, and unfortunately, as of the time of recording this video, Ship 38 had 2 consecutive test scrubs on Thursday and Friday. Sure enough, on Monday, SpaceX got the job done. The road was closed, and we saw a 6-engine static fire of Ship 38, one step closer to Starship Flight 11. With engine testing complete, Ship 38 will likely roll back to the production site to be readied for flight, which could happen pretty quickly given that, again, a lot of the heat shield is further along than previous ships. Teams will also probably remove all of the ship testing modifications at the pad and prepare it for flight. Hopefully this time, unlike with Ship 37, we get a proper rollback of 38 and they don't have to repeat ship static fire testing. And another good sign that Flight 11 is coming sooner rather than later was spotted on Saturday when a hot staging ring rolled out of the Star Factory. We expect that this is Booster 15's ring, and provided it is, this is the last Block 2 hot stage ring we'll see installed on a booster. How wild is that? Hopefully by next week's Starbase update, both ship and booster will be inside of the mega bays and getting their final preparations for flight. When do you think Flight 11 will be? You know the drill. Let us know in the comments. I hope to see y'all again next week. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget, be excellent to each other.